Think about this for a second. You are sitting in a dark theater, staring at a screen, and suddenly you feel an overwhelming, almost aggressive urge to drink an ice-cold soda. You haven't seen a commercial for it. Nobody has talked to you about it. The thought just pops into your head, feeling entirely, completely like your own original idea. Now, what if I told you it wasn't your idea at all? What if that thought was planted there, deliberately and scientifically, by a corporate executive you will never meet? Here is something that might genuinely surprise you. Until the year 1974, the United States government had absolutely no ban on subliminal messaging. None. For the first 2.5 decades of the television era, the exact moment when the glowing screen became the centerpiece of the American living room, corporations, advertisers, and broadcasters had completely free rein to flash hidden commands directly into your brain. So, the question isn't just academic. It is actually kind of terrifying. How did the most powerful consumer economy on Earth operate for decades with a loophole that allowed the literal hacking of the human subconscious? And perhaps more importantly, what actually happened in 1974 that forced the government to finally step in and declare this invisible weapon a threat to the American public? The answers to those questions take us deep into a story about Cold War paranoia, corporate greed, and the raw tension between a public that wanted to be entertained and an advertising industry that was deeply, almost pathologically obsessed with controlling human behavior. Because here's the thing most people don't realize. Subliminal messaging didn't just appear out of nowhere. It was the natural evolution of an economic system that had realized you can't just sell people products anymore. You have to sell them desires. And if they don't have those desires, you have to manufacture them, silently and invisibly, right under their noses. This is the story of how your own mind was turned into a battleground, and how the rules of that battle are still shaping every single choice you make today. Let me take you back to the early 1950s. The Second World War was over, the American economy was booming, and something entirely new was quietly invading the American living room: the television set. In 1950, only about 9% of American households owned a TV. By the end of that decade, that number had exploded to nearly 90%. It was a cultural takeover of unprecedented speed. For the very first time in human history, corporations had a direct, glowing portal into the private sanctuaries of millions of families. But there was a problem. The old ways of advertising just weren't working anymore. Before the war, selling a product was a straightforward, almost boring process. You told the consumer what the product did, how much it cost, and why it was better than the competition. It was an appeal to logic. You bought soap because it cleaned your hands. You bought a car because it got you to work. But as the factories that once built tanks and airplanes transitioned into making washing machines, refrigerators, and automobiles, the market became completely flooded. There were simply too many products and not enough natural demand. The powerful advertising executives on Madison Avenue realized that appealing to logic was a dead end. To keep the massive economic engine running, they had to bypass the conscious mind entirely. They needed to tap into the unconscious. And this is where the dark art of modern persuasion was truly born. Advertising agencies began quietly hiring psychologists, psychoanalysts, and behavioral scientists. They started reading Sigmund Freud. They stopped selling the utility of a product and started selling identity, status, and emotional fulfillment. They realized that human beings are fundamentally irrational creatures, driven by deep, hidden anxieties and desires. If you could link a product to a primal human urge, like the fear of social rejection or the desire for power, people would buy it without even knowing why. The screen was no longer just a box that played shows. It was a psychological tool, a weapon of mass persuasion, and the stage was perfectly set for the ultimate experiment in mind control. In the summer of 1957, the theory of subconscious manipulation leaped off the pages of psychology textbooks and stepped directly into the real world. The man who pulled the trigger was a struggling market researcher named James Vickery. Vickery was not a mad scientist in a secret lab. He was just a desperate businessman looking for a profitable edge. But what he claimed to have done in a small town in New Jersey would completely terrify the American public and change the advertising industry forever. Vickery set up a hidden experiment at a local drive-in movie theater in Fort Lee during routine screenings of the hit movie Picnic. Unbeknownst to the thousands of ordinary people sitting comfortably in their cars, watching the film with their families, Vickery had installed a custom-built mechanical projector in the booth. This specialized machine was designed to do something no one had ever attempted on the general public before. Every 5 seconds, it flashed two incredibly simple phrases directly onto the giant screen. Eat popcorn and drink Coca-Cola, but here was the terrifying catch. These phrases were projected for exactly 1/3000th of a second. That is a speed so incredibly fast that the human eye cannot consciously register it. The audience saw nothing but the movie. There were no disruptions, no weird visual glitches, no visible advertisements of any kind. Consciously, their brains perceived absolutely nothing unusual. But unconsciously, Vickery boldly claimed that the subconscious mind soaked up the hidden commands like a dry sponge. 6 weeks later, Vickery called a massive press conference in New York City to announce his results. The numbers he presented were absolutely staggering. Coca-Cola sales in the theater lobby had spiked by over 18%. Popcorn sales had exploded by an astonishing 57%. The implications were immediate and chilling. If Vickery was telling the truth, it meant that human free will was essentially an illusion. A man with a projector could bypass your rational mind, hack directly into your subconscious, and force you to consume. And the absolute scariest part? You would walk away confidently believing the choice was entirely yours. When the news of Vickery's popcorn experiment broke, the American public did not just get angry. They completely lost their minds. And to understand why this sparked such intense, widespread panic, you have to look at exactly what else was happening in the world in 1957. The United States was locked in the freezing, paranoid grip of the Cold War. Every single day, the newspapers were dominated by the existential threat of the Soviet Union. But the fear wasn't just about nuclear bombs dropping from the sky. It was far more psychological. This was the exact era when the term brainwashing first entered the American vocabulary, following terrifying reports of captured soldiers in the Korean War seemingly turning against their own country. Rumors were already swirling that government intelligence agencies, particularly the CIA, were conducting highly classified, deeply unethical experiments in human mind control. People were terrified of hidden communist agents, secret plots, and unseen forces manipulating society from the inside out. Popular culture reflected this dread perfectly. It was the cultural anxiety that would soon give birth to movies like The Manchurian Candidate, where human beings were literally programmed to act as mindless assassins. So, when a market researcher proudly stood up in New York City and declared he could successfully control human behavior with invisible flashing words, the public connected the dots immediately. If a movie theater could secretly force you to buy a cup of soda, what was stopping the government from using the exact same technology? What was stopping a ruthless political candidate from flashing "Vote for me" across millions of television screens during the evening news? The implications were apocalyptic. The American people realized that their elections, their democracy, and their very thoughts could be silently hijacked without a single shot being fired. Subliminal messaging wasn't just viewed as a sleazy corporate sales trick. It was viewed as the ultimate invisible weapon. And the terrifying reality was that there were absolutely no laws in place to stop anyone from using it against you. While the American public was busy scanning the skies for Soviet threats and panicking over political mind control, the real invasion was already happening. But it wasn't being orchestrated by foreign spies in trench coats. It was being executed by guys in sharp suits working on Madison Avenue. The advertising industry saw the public panic over subliminal messaging not as a warning, but as a brilliant blueprint. For them, the human subconscious was simply an untapped gold mine waiting to be fully exploited. By the late 1950s and into the 1960s, a quiet but aggressive arms race began in the world of corporate marketing. Advertising agencies started pouring massive amounts of money into motivational research. If flashing a word for a fraction of a second was too controversial, they needed to find smoother, more sophisticated ways to bypass the conscious brain. And they did exactly that. They started embedding hidden, highly suggestive imagery directly into standard print advertisements. If you looked closely at a popular magazine ad for expensive liquor, the ice cubes in the glass weren't always just ice cubes. Commercial artists were meticulously airbrushing hidden words and shapes, almost always related to sex, power, or danger, deep into the shadows and reflections. Your conscious mind just saw a refreshing drink. But the primitive, unconscious part of your brain registered those hidden cues and immediately associated the product with a deep, biological urge. Television, however, remained the ultimate delivery system. Advertisers quickly realized that when a person sits in a dark room staring at a glowing box, their brain naturally shifts into a passive, highly suggestible state. It is a light trance, very similar to mild hypnosis. In this relaxed state, the human brain stops critically analyzing incoming information. Broadcasters began experimenting with complex audio tracks, burying low-frequency whispers beneath the loud, upbeat jingles of television commercials. They played with highly specific colors, pacing, and rapid visual cuts designed entirely to disorient your logical mind and trigger an immediate emotional reaction. This was no longer just about selling cars, soap, or cigarettes. It was the absolute engineering of human desire. It was the deliberate, scientific hacking of the American consumer. And the absolute darkest part of this entire era? Every single bit of it was completely legal. There were no federal regulations, no consumer protection laws, and no FCC bans standing in their way. The gates to your mind were left wide open, and the world's biggest corporations simply walked right in. But right when the paranoia reached its absolute peak, something completely unexpected happened. A massive plot twist that almost nobody saw coming. The foundational event of this entire panic, the famous 1957 drive-in movie experiment that started it all, was actually a complete and total fabrication. In 1962, James Vickery finally broke his silence. He gave a quiet interview to an advertising magazine and confessed the shocking truth. He admitted he never conducted the massive, highly scientific study he had claimed. The reality was much more pathetic. His market research business was failing, he was rapidly drowning in debt, and he desperately needed a massive public relations stunt to attract wealthy new corporate clients. There was no magical 57% spike in popcorn sales. There was no secret projector hacking people's brains in New Jersey. It was all a desperate, meticulously calculated lie. When the truth finally came out, you would naturally think the American public would breathe a massive sigh of relief. You would assume the government would step back, the media would move on, and the intense psychological paranoia would completely fade away. But that is exactly where this story takes an even darker turn. Because here is the truly terrifying reality about this great hoax. Vickery might have faked his specific data, but he had successfully let the genie out of the bottle. He had planted an incredibly dangerous, highly infectious idea into the minds of the most powerful people on Earth. Advertisers, politicians, and intelligence agencies did not care that the original drive-in study was a fraud. They only cared about the underlying concept. They realized that bypassing human consciousness wasn't just a neat science fiction plot, it was a theoretical goldmine. And instead of dropping the idea, they completely doubled down. They started pouring millions of dollars into actual, real-world scientific research to turn Vickery's fake experiment into a functioning reality. The hoax had accidentally birthed a very real monster, and the invisible war for your mind was truly just getting started. Even though James Vickery's famous popcorn study was exposed as a complete fraud, the damage was already done. The absolute worst thing about a brilliant lie is that it usually inspires someone else to make it a reality. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, the technology had finally caught up with the dangerous theory. And this is when the true, documented era of subconscious manipulation officially began. The invisible war moved out of the movie theaters and directly into the places you visited every single day. Retailers and massive department stores were the first to successfully weaponize this concept. They started using specially designed background music, commonly known as muzak, playing softly while you shopped for groceries or clothes. But beneath the cheerful, elevator-style tunes, they buried a high-frequency audio track. These were spoken commands, mixed just beneath the threshold of conscious human hearing, repeating phrases like, "I am honest," and "I will not steal." And unlike Vickery's fake experiment, this time, the results were terrifyingly real. Stores reported massive immediate drops in shoplifting. They had successfully reprogrammed human behavior without anyone ever knowing. But the real holy grail was still television. Advertisers began pushing the boundaries of what the screen could do. In late 1973, an extremely popular commercial for a board game called Husker Du aired on national television. During the fast-paced ad, a hidden frame was spliced directly into the film. For a fraction of a second, the words, "Get it," flashed across the screen in bold letters. It was so fast that parents watching with their kids completely missed it. But the children's highly receptive brains absorbed the command perfectly. This wasn't just a sneaky trick, it was a profound exploitation of human biology. Scientists now know that your brain processes visual information exponentially faster than your conscious mind can comprehend. Your eyes literally see everything, even if the conscious you doesn't realize it. The corporations knew this. Politicians started realizing this too, understanding that they could theoretically flash negative, fear-inducing words over their opponent's face during campaign ads. The situation was rapidly spinning completely out of control. The American public was being treated like mindless laboratory rats. By the end of 1973, the complaints were piling up, public outrage was exploding again, and the federal government could no longer pretend it wasn't happening. The FCC had to step in. By the time 1974 finally rolled around, the sheer volume of public panic forced the federal government's hand. The Federal Communications Commission, the powerful agency that strictly controls American television and radio, decided they had to act. They issued a formal, highly publicized public notice. In this official document, the FCC explicitly stated that the use of subliminal perception techniques was inherently deceptive and totally contrary to the public interest. Broadcasters across the country were sternly warned that using these hidden messages could put their extremely valuable operating licenses at serious risk. Finally, after decades of psychological experimentation, the American public felt safe. The invisible weapon had been officially banned. Right? Well, not exactly. And this is where the history gets incredibly frustrating. Because if you actually read the fine print of that famous 1974 FCC document, you will discover a terrifying legal reality. The FCC did not actually pass a strict federal law against subliminal messaging. They did not make it a serious criminal offense. Nobody was going to a federal prison for flashing hidden commands onto your television screen. It was essentially just a strongly worded policy statement. A mere warning. A bureaucratic slap on the wrist. Think about what that actually means in practice. The government admitted that this manipulative technology was highly dangerous. They openly acknowledged that it bypassed human free will. Yet, they refused to create a rock-solid, unbreakable law with massive criminal penalties to stop it permanently. It meant that the absolute worst thing that could happen to a massive corporation caught using these psychological tricks was risking a fine or a tedious license review. For a multi-billion-dollar advertising agency or a ruthless political campaign, that was not a terrifying punishment. That was just a minor business expense. The door was never completely locked. It was just quietly pushed shut, leaving a crack wide open for the smartest and richest companies to slip right through without anyone noticing. And because it wasn't a strict law, the game simply evolved into something far more sophisticated. But here is the most chilling part of this entire history. Today, nobody uses 1/3000th of a second subliminal flashes anymore. Not because they are afraid of the FCC. They stopped using them because those primitive flashes are completely obsolete. Why would a modern corporation risk using a sneaky camera trick when they can just use an algorithm to map your entire psychological profile? The screen in your living room has been replaced by the glowing screen resting in your pocket. And the tactics have evolved into something that makes the 1950s look like child's play. Silicon Valley did not just study those ruthless Madison Avenue executives, they absolutely perfected their methods. Today, technology companies track exactly how long you hover over an image. They measure how fast you scroll. They monitor what makes you angry, what makes you insecure, and what grabs your absolute attention. They do not need to whisper hidden words into your ear to bypass your conscious mind. They just feed your subconscious exactly what it secretly craves, until you are completely addicted. Infinite scrolling, micro-targeted advertisements, and precise notifications are all meticulously engineered to trigger massive dopamine releases. It is all perfectly designed to shut down the logical, rational part of your brain. This is the ultimate, terrifying evolution of the mind control experiments from the Cold War. You genuinely believe you are freely choosing to watch that next video. You think you are independently deciding to buy that product. You believe your outrage is your own original emotion. But you are wrong. Your choices are being artificially engineered in real time by incredibly powerful algorithms that know your deepest insecurities better than you know yourself. The 1974 FCC policy did not save us from subliminal manipulation. It simply forced the manipulators to get much smarter. The brainwashing never actually stopped. It just became highly personalized, perfectly legal, and completely voluntary. We willingly stare into the psychological projector every single day. So, the next time you pick up your phone and suddenly feel an overwhelming urge to buy something, ask yourself, is this really my thought? Or did someone else quietly put it there? If this story shifted your perspective on how the world really works, make sure to hit that subscribe button and drop a like. We go deep into the hidden machinery of power and control. Question everything, and I will see you next time.